Oh, you're slick. You investors in hate. You Saddams and you Bushes. You Bin Ladens and snakes. You billionaire bullies. You're a globalized curse.
Welcome to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, July 1st, 2021, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California, and we would love to have some rain. I'm Mary Massey with co-host John Sakowicz. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary, and good morning to our audience.
Today's show and all programs will be archived here at KMUD and at our show website, heroespatriots.org. We invite you as our listeners to call in with questions for our guests today. You can do so by calling 707-923-3911. We will take as many calls as time permits, and we ask that you be brief with your question. As you heard, it's Dorothy behind the board there. We thank her every Thursday as she does a terrific job for our program. We have one guest today for the entire hour, and I imagine we won't get to everything that we need to, but we're going to talk about the beginnings of the internet and what it's morphed into. The internet had its origins in the efforts to build and interconnect computer networks that arose from research and development in the United States and involved international collaboration, particularly with researchers in the United Kingdom and France. Computer science was an emerging discipline in the late 1950s, and that began to consider time sharing between computer users, and later the possibility of achieving this over wide area networks. And that brings us to this morning's guest. We have with us Dr. Sascha Meinrath. His research focuses on broadband connectivity, distributed communications, digital feudalism, digital craftsmanship, telecommunications, spectrum policy, cybersecurity, which is dear to our program's heart, privacy, and disruptive technology. So we would like to welcome Professor Sascha Meinrath to the program. Professor, are you with us?
I am indeed. It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome to the program. John's going to kick us off today, and we thank you for joining us.
Hi, Sascha. Great to have you on the program. I've been a big admirer of your work for a long time, and in fact, I do quite a bit of work in this area. I advise several of the companies that are in the In-Q-Tel portfolio. Let's start off with the big questions. The coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic had a huge impact on internet connectivity. How did it have that impact, and what are the implications going forward into the future?
Yeah, so COVID really shined a light on pre-existing inequalities. And it did this because, in essence, we all became much more reliant in our social lives and in our professional lives for education, even for things like healthcare, on internet connectivity. While we were all locked down, we realized that, oh, wow, these are incredibly powerful tools, this internet of ours. On the other hand, for those that didn't have connectivity or had inadequate connectivity, their lives were very detrimentally impacted. And that's at the individual and the household level, which are students that can't learn because they can't do telepresence for their schooling, but also for a lot of our economy. The mom and pop shops that had survived via face-to-face interactions were put at a competitive disadvantage if they were unable to transition to an online existence. Well, all of this also put a lot of strain on the internet itself. Once we moved from offices, let's say, to our homes for our professional lives, and once people started doing teleconferencing and sort of every meeting became a teleconference meeting, we needed a lot more capacity, not necessarily on the downside, which is to say, if you've streamed Netflix or Amazon Prime, your streaming of choice, the downlink from the internet to your home that was usually adequate for most people most of the time. But the uplink, that is to say, your video presence from your home to the internet, well, it turns out that our internet was not adequately provisioned for, let's say, two kids and a parent all doing teleconferencing at the same time. Two kids in school, one parent trying to do their professional life. And what this created then was, in essence, a lot of problems, even for those that had what we would consider to be broadband connections. It turns out that that was inadequate, that they had, in essence, a very bad experience attempting to survive through the pandemic. And, of course, all of this had been pre-warned. In essence, many of us in this space had said for years that the way that we're provisioning connectivity, the ways that we are allowing these inequalities to not just exist, but be maintained over time, creates a situation where society as a whole ends up being, in essence, ripped apart. And so COVID acted as a force multiplier for inequalities in ways that, even though we knew this problem was coming, officially we did nothing to ameliorate it. And so now, today, in the aftermath of COVID, we're scrambling. We're dropping tens of billions of taxpayer dollars in an attempt to kind of make up for some of those historical shortcomings and inequalities.
If you were advising the Biden administration on technology policy, what would be some of your recommendations? And are these being covered in the new infrastructure bill?
Mm-hmm. I have spoken with a number of senior officials spanning a number of different government agencies over the past 6 months on this. And my number one recommendation is that we are in desperate need of a comprehensive plan spanning all of these different programs, all of these different initiatives that, in essence, sets the goal to be universal, affordable connectivity. I've even gone one step further and to say what we really need, given the critical nature of broadband connectivity today, is free baseline connectivity for everyone, everywhere. And in essence, we are no closer to a comprehensive plan today than we were last year, than we were when we announced and released the 2010 so-called National Broadband Plan, which was anything but. What we're really suffering through, in essence, is a hodgepodge of disconnected initiatives and interventions, many of which have the best of intentions, but because they are not coordinated, and because we haven't set a goal of every house being online, and because we don't have meaningful accountability, much less any meaningful documentation of how well we're doing, which tactics work and which ones don't, all of that combines to a fairly dysfunctional state today and a high likelihood that we will remain in a fairly dysfunctional state at the end of this $50 to $100 billion investment in broadband infrastructure.
And how would you advise the Biden administration on issues like privacy, surveillance, and civil liberties? And let's keep in mind that companies like Google and Facebook have their trillion-dollar capitalizations because they're in no business other than big data and data mining. I mean, privacy violations, surveillance, and civil liberties violations are the bread and butter of their business. And let's make no mistake about that. We've had on our show people like Edward Snowden and Tom Drake and Bill Binney, who have all confirmed this. Every piece of electronic hardware we hold in our hands, be it our cell phones or our laptops, have backdoors in it that just allow data to be swept up. So how would you advise the Biden administration on things like privacy, surveillance, and civil liberties?
Yeah, and I think you've actually named three incredibly important figures. Drake was an early whistleblower saying, hey, look, these companies are colluding to collect our information, our data. our private missives in a manner that is certainly unethical, probably illegal, and as it turns out, federal courts have eventually caught up to these technological realities and ruled program after program to be illegal. Likewise, Snowden revealed a whole hodgepodge of different programs, many of which are still in place today, and many of which have thus, since the 2013 revelations, been ruled to be illegal. And Bill Binney set up a privacy-protecting system that would enable, legitimate law enforcement efforts to surveil ne'er-do-wells. And that was dumped in favor of a privacy-abrogating system that didn't actually work. And so time and time again, what we've actually seen in this space is not just the corporate surveillance. And you are absolutely correct. These corporations are very much making their money by commercializing our privacy. But it's also this collusion between these mega corporations and government. The prison program is, exhibit A for this. But the NSA, which is forbidden by law from doing domestic surveillance, was in bed with many of the largest, trillion-dollar market capitalization companies in the country to surveil domestically. And again, what we've seen, and this goes from Democrat to Republican, back to Democrat, back to Republican, back to Democrat administrations, one after the next, not doing enough to prioritize our civil liberties, our constitutional rights, even when at times that may mean that they miss some ne'er-do-wells. In essence, if you're doing surveillance to protect the Constitution by abrogating the Constitution,
right,
you've really failed in a fundamental mission here. And since I work with a number of folks coming out of the surveillance industry and who are former analysts, they'll be the first to tell you much of the data they're getting, and they're being inundated with data, is useless. And that in essence, there's this myth that somehow we can perfect this electronic surveillance and therefore don't need to invest as much in the difficult human intelligence side of the equation, and somehow magically we'll be able to identify all the ne'er-do-wells. Well, one only need look at the time after time and again these domestic mass shootings to see how ineffective that strategy has been.
Right. Or the assault on the Capitol.
Absolutely. Well, that was in plain sight. It's mind-boggling to me, right? That the same agencies that are saying that they need more information were incapable of doing a threat assessment that pretty much everyone watching any social media platform was like, oh, this is going to be a problem. Exactly. And this points to, in essence, an accountability problem where we don't look at things like the false negatives. How often do we miss something that's right in front of us, like January 6th, and the false positives? How often do we mistakenly identify a potential threat that, in fact, is not a threat at all?
I have one more question before I turn the mic over to Mary for a little while. We've also had Ray McGovern, a 27-year veteran of the CIA, who has done the daily White House briefings for 3 different presidents on our show. And we've had Colleen Rowley on our show, the Time Person of the Year in 2003, the FBI agent who blew the whistle on the FBI's incompetence on 9/11, that they had the intelligence but failed to act on it. And both Colleen Rowley and Ray McGovern said that there exists a program in the federal government called parallel construction, where the feds can go into your electronics and tweak the data to literally incriminate you in a crime. They can frame you for a crime. I'm hoping to write the biography of Ross Ulbricht. I just visited Tucson. He was the founder of the Silk Road on the dark web. He's the only person in the history of our country who's received 2 life sentences without the possibility for parole as a first-time offender for a nonviolent crime. So dangerous was he in setting and establishing the dark web and the deep web and Silk Road. That's how dangerous he is as a libertarian. And he claims that he was set up by the feds in a program called parallel construction. What do you think the potential for parallel construction and framing people for crimes are in this new digital landscape?
Yeah, so parallel construction is an incredibly dangerous phenomenon. There's a 2019 Inspector General's report that calls this out. What it is in essence, let's say there's a secret program you don't want anyone to know about where you're surveilling, somebody or a constituency. You go before a judge, and instead of saying, hey, we got this evidence through this program, you lie, right? You parallel construct the program that was used or the manner in which you got this evidence. Now, this goes directly to the heart of rule of law, right? If you or I went before a judge and lied, it would be called perjury, and we would be held in contempt, and we would be in big trouble. When law enforcement goes before a judge and lies, well, in essence, that evidence can often become inadmissible. And especially where you have a situation where this parallel construction is used to, say, capture somebody, and it was gleaned via a program that is illegal. Well, you never have an opportunity to challenge the manner in which that evidence was collected. And as such, yes, you then have this problem of, the Obrichs of the world saying, hey, I was set up, or the evidence was collected illegally, but I can't prove it because, in essence, there's been this cover-up. Now, It's not just the fringes that are saying this, right? This 2019 Inspector General of the United States of America report is saying that this is actually widespread within places like the DEA. And time again, we've seen this kind of problem boil up. There was just this month, or I should say last month in June, a PCLOB, which is the President's Commission on Civil Liberties it's basically a board that's supposed to oversee NSA and other activities. There was a dissenting minority opinion saying this entire process has continually failed to hold to account serious problems, illegal activities, where surveillance and surveillance programs are abrogating our civil liberties, our human rights, our constitutional rights. Now, how many people have been convicted on evidence illegally collected is, at this very moment, an open question. But I would guarantee it's more than one. And the fact that we continue to refuse, as a matter of national policy, to both investigate and hold to account those that have been engaging in illegal surveillance, much less vacating the judgments predicated upon illegally collected surveillance, is, I think, a real crisis point for the judicial branch.
Right.
And so I would hope that there's going to be a reckoning. I am well aware how messy that reckoning would have to be. And, of course, none of this would have happened had law enforcement simply followed the law. Get a warrant is not a complicated issue. It's not a novel idea. But for some reason, when it comes to electronic surveillance, there has been a long-standing, in essence, a long-standing process by which more and more rights-infringing and illegal activities have been passed off as just the, business as usual. And that modus operandi is incredibly problematic. It belongs more in a dictatorial regime than in a democratic, civil liberties-based constitutional democracy.
Yeah. Well, we have a long history, as you know, with that type of illegal surveillance, going back to CONINTELPRO And right here in Redwood Country, the feds tried to frame Judy Berry and Earth First. And that case fell apart, and she ended up getting a multi-million-dollar judgment. So the feds have a long history in electronic surveillance, but it becomes even a knottier question with digital surveillance. I mean, you can literally, just like you can catfish, say on a dating site, invent a whole profile, a whole fabricated persona. The feds can do that with the suspect digitally. It's easy to do, and they do it. And our country has got a long tradition with that.
That's right. And it's COINTELPRO. I mean, people forget that, the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King on down, they were targeted explicitly as a matter of national policy by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in order to collect, often illegally, personal information to discredit them. And this is established fact. This isn't some sort of, conspiracy. This is what's already known. We're still trying to get full information on what the FBI was doing a half century ago.
Right.
Even though this is, targeted some of the, luminaries of the time, there still has not been a full public disclosure of the illegal nature of those activities. And many of those strategies, many of the tactics have evolved, right, take advantage of digital communications, but are in essence the same playbook as was run a half century ago.
It's 23 minutes past the hour, and if you're listening in, just tuning in, this is Heroes and Patriots program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. If you would like to speak with our guest, Professor Sascha Meinrath, you may call 707-923-3911. Please be brief with your questions. I want to go back to something that you said earlier in the program. You had your beginnings as an environmental activist, not anything to do with technology and computers, etc. And I admire that you are now trying to champion free baseline connectivity for everyone. And I'm curious as to how you would see that not only happen, but how would it be regulated, given that we have all of these security issues right now, both domestic and abroad? Could you speak to that or so? And then we'll take a brief pause on the half hour.
Yeah, so, free baseline connectivity for everyone everywhere is an idea that will eventually grab on, that people will realize that, simply put, that's what we need. And we experience this in very minuscule scale whenever we go to, say, a cafe that has free connectivity in the cafe. And more places are providing free connectivity, at least baseline. We just haven't made that a national priority. But this notion of free access to some communal resource is age-old. People forget that the Postal Service used to provide free postage for newspapers. Right? When Alexis de Tocqueville was writing about democracy in America in the 1840s, one of the key elements that he said made the U.S. nation state was that everyone was communicating, everyone was gathering and talking about media, and one of the fundamental ways in which that was achieved was the free transit of packets, right? The free transit of newspapers 150 years ago. Well, that notion is just as powerful today, that in essence, because so much of our society today relies on the internet, and because the benefits that accrue to everyone are so great when we get everyone online, that it makes sense for us to invest in that. And we have made these kinds of fundamental investments in prior eras. So the notion of getting rid of the King's Road and providing free access to roadways, it's very old, right? The idea of free primary education, that was a real American achievement. And it was necessary in many ways because we understood at the dawn of the industrial era that having an educated population would benefit everyone involved in that society, in our society. Well, here we are, We're in the midst of a digital era, and we haven't kind of updated our social contract. We haven't said, hey, look, pretty much everything we do today in some way intersects with this newfangled communications medium, the internet. And everyone would benefit if we made sure that everyone had some baseline connectivity there. Well, this idea will eventually come to pass. The question is how much opportunity cost accrues along the way. So
we're going to take a brief
COVID. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I was just going to say we're going to take a brief pause and then we'll pick it up there. You want to thank people? I have to do
Yes, Mary just elbowed me.
Well, wait, we want to do a pledge. They're in the middle of their pledge.
Yeah, they're in the middle of the pledge. And I want to encourage everyone listening to become a member. Our last show, June 3rd, was my birthday, and we got a number of new members. I also had a Facebook pledge page, and I want to thank all the people who donated through the pledge page. I now have to match that amount.
Oh, boy.
so KMUD is owed a check from yours truly. But I want to say that I've been on radio here since 2008, and I've been at a number of different stations. And KMUD by far has been the best place to host a show. This is true community radio. It's not public radio. It's true community radio. And we are a community of kind, loving, informed, progressive people. Let me repeat that because they may extract that and run this on other shows. KMUD is a true community of kind, loving, informed, progressive people. They host shows like these and many, many other interesting shows. And wherever you are, wherever you live, whatever you do, we want you to become part of this community. You don't have to live in Humboldt County. You don't have to live in Northern California. If this is the kind of program you like, please support the station, KMUD, by becoming a member. Thank you.
Dorothy? Welcome back to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. If you've just joined us, today is Thursday, July 1st, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey with my co-host, John Sakowicz, and we've been talking about all things internet, cybersecurity, regulations, and so forth. Our guest this morning is Professor Sascha Meinrath, and I failed to mention that he created the Open Technology Institute, and I wanted to turn to that. And out of that was the outgrowth of XLab. So, Sascha, would you talk to us a little bit about your development and creation of open technology, and then how XLab, what is the purpose of XLab?
Sure. So a lot of that comes out of being first and foremost a practitioner, working in community, deploying community broadband solutions at the turn of the millennia, right? Year 2K. So one has to imagine a time where most people in communities had nothing more than a dial-up, talking about how broadband connectivity for everyone was going to be an essential service, and how ludicrous that sounded a mere 20 years ago. Well, through that work, I got very involved with a number of federal proceedings, because what we found out very quickly was that the rule of law hadn't caught up to technological reality. And via that, I was recruited to go and work at a think tank in D.C. And arriving in D.C. was stunned to learn that whereas Washington, D.C. has more lawyers per capita than pretty much anywhere else on the planet, that is not the case with technologists. And what we found out very quickly was the technological acumen of 2004 to 2008 Washington, D.C. was abysmal. The people had no idea how technologies worked And yet, at the same time, we're engaging in key decision-making, legislative and regulatory rulings that would directly and often detrimentally impact the viability of technologies. And so in 2008 and into 2009, I created this Open Technology Institute. And as the name would, you can infer from the name, I was very interested in this idea that if technologies were not open, if we couldn't kick the tires, if we were prevented from understanding how they were being operationalized, how they work, that would cause huge problems. Mm-hmm. And since 2008, this has become, I think, over the last dozen plus years, an ascendant issue. And what it points to is, we've gone from sort of voices in the wilderness talking about how, these proprietary systems, these companies that are, growing in power but aren't accountable to anything, the lack of rule of law over how technologies are being used and often how they're being abused, that all of this combines into a really bad, current situation. And finally, thankfully, we're beginning to, at the national level, pay a bit more attention to this. But I'm also a realist, and I understand that there is a tactic that's used by Republican and Democratic administrations alike to have great rhetoric on the importance of addressing these shortcomings and simultaneously very little action to actually update our rule of law. And telecommunications is one of these weird spaces where, the rule of law governing the Internet basically dates back to 1996, the Telecom Act of 1996. And for all of us that were online in 96, we understand the Internet was very different back then. But more importantly, it just hasn't been fundamentally updated in a quarter of a century.
Wow.
And I think anyone would realize that that's a real problem. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Sascha, who are some of your partners in developing open source, low-cost community wireless networks?
So back in 2000 to 2004-ish, the partnerships that were built were amongst, in essence, geeks who were playing around with the first generations of what became known as Wi-Fi technology. That when I got my start, it was still what's called the 802.11 standard. It was pre-certification of Wi-Fi. But it's in essence these early iterations, the first generations of consumer-grade digital equipment that allowed for connecting computers wirelessly together. And that, for many of us, was quite revolutionary because all of a sudden then you didn't have to, stick a wire into one computer and run a ring of wires to the other computers. You could go across things like streets, for example. And the partners were really this hodgepodge of different groups, both across the United States, but also internationally. And so we ended up with this consortium of community-based entities, and we started gathering at what became known as the International Summit for Community Wireless Networks, starting in 2004 and continuing through the next decade. We started gathering to swap notes and information and technologies amongst this international cadre of folks. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that when you look beneath, the proprietary wrappers of a lot of today's Wi-Fi routers, you often will find things that were developed, if not by me and my teams, by the folks that we were swapping code with 15, 20 years ago.
Wow.
And, in many ways, this was a incredibly promising moment that maybe was a little too far ahead of the curve. We were talking about ubiquitous connectivity in 2000 into 2010, but it's really only been, I think, over the last half decade or so that people have realized this isn't just important, it's an essential service. And in many ways, COVID has double underlined the import of communications and connectivity for everyone.
Dr. Meinrath, we have a caller. If you feel comfortable, we'll take that now.
Sure.
Caller, go ahead.
Oh, thank you very much for this incredibly rich and important show. I was going to ask you to connect these important comments about recognizing that this is important but essential because of this last year with what you were saying before about the threats from the system with surveillance and the genre. I wonder where the champions are for this, because as we talk so much about democracy and the need for understanding civil participation, and there's a lot of focus in the foundation world, for instance, of promoting democracy, where are the real champions for understanding the undermining of democracy by what the negative part of the lack of rule of law with regard to the internet and surveillance and the partnership between the federal government and private sector?
Thank you, caller.
So, if I may, connectivity is a real Faustian bargain. It provides us all of these incredible resources, and it's an incredibly powerful tool that can be greatly abused. And the reality is that it has this profound liberatory and empowerment potential and a profound nefarious, detrimental kind of dark side to exactly the same medium. And we're living through this era where we're experiencing both. And we're experiencing both in many ways because rule of law hasn't caught up to the existence, the prevalence of this very powerful tool. Now, in the same way that I wouldn't give, say, a chainsaw to my 2-year-old, we clearly need to engage more with not just youth, but users of the internet. We need to engage in sort of a systematic rethinking of our pedagogy, of school, of what we need to teach individuals to protect their privacy. And all of that individual level literacy, digital literacy, is essential, but also insufficient. That there's only so much we as individuals can do to prevent, say, a Google or an Amazon or a Facebook from mining all sorts of information about us. And as such, we still do need rule of law that says, look, nobody gets to use this tool for this purpose. And all of that requires regulatory and legal and legislative intervention. And all of those key decisions, or most of those key decisions, have in essence been mortgaged and deferred for so long that we're living through, in many ways, these detrimental impacts that affect many of our lives. And many of us are very unaware of exactly how we may have been harmed or discriminated against. But some of the things that we have seen, for example, are travel sites that had charged users of Apple products more than PC users. We have seen women being offered ads for jobs that pay less than men. We've seen discriminatory advertising targeting minorities, and especially African Americans, based upon a AI reading of their name. All of these things exist. Many of them are certainly unethical, unprofessional, potentially illegal. But we're living in an era where there's no mechanism for meaningful accountability of the nefarious use of these technologies. So we need the digital literacy, but we also need a major systemic, society-wide upgrade of rule of law. And without that, the harms that are accruing are also going to grow exponentially.
Sascha, we started out the program talking about the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on digital transformation, and one of those implications has been the adoption or the acceleration of adoption of cloud-based infrastructure. That includes cloud native applications such as containers, virtual machines, and APIs, and an increasingly disparate environment has been created that security leaders are now having to focus on and to close that cloud visibility gap. Do you care to comment on this new whole cloud-based infrastructure landscape and where the pandemic has taken us?
Yeah, so in many ways, as we become more and more reliant upon cloud-based computing, cloud-based applications and services, as the business models have transitioned from, in essence, the smarts at the edge of the network to, in essence, the old school dumb terminal central computer mechanism, right? The architecture of our services and applications today are that your end computer isn't storing your information. It's sharing it with some central process, some central repository, not because it necessarily needs to, but because that's what allows for data collection and commercialization. Well, all of that then creates additional threats to us, the end user. And what we're living through once again is because there are no meaningful...
And how does artificial intelligence play into this discussion?
So what was the question? Could you please repeat it?
How does artificial intelligence play into this whole new public cloud infrastructure?
Yeah, so artificial intelligence is sort of a misnomer in that what we really have are very smart algorithms. There's no actual machine intelligence behind that. It's just a very complex program written by humans. But what it does allow is, for example, discrimination that if a human did would be blatantly illegal to exist, and then for these companies to sort of blame the algorithm. Say, well, we didn't even know it was doing this. And fundamentally what drives this is that there's no meaningful accountability. So think about, say, a car. Let's say a car manufacturer puts out a car that is fundamentally flawed. It, in essence, is broken. Well, there would be a recall, and people would be entitled to compensation for that. But in an era where, in essence, time and time and time again, people are putting out flawed applications and services that get hacked, credit card companies that get hacked, credit card reporting systems like Equifax that get hacked.
Right.
And even though we, the end user, are, in essence, bearing the cost of that, the companies are not meaningfully being held to account, and we, the folks that are put at this disadvantage, are not recompensed for the time and aggravation caused by that loss. And that is, again, a recipe for disaster. In the atomic, the built world, when a company puts out a flawed product, it's very clear that they are responsible for the flaws in that product. And yet in the digital realm, our rule of law hasn't caught up to say, hey, these digital devices that are getting hacked, that are causing us problems, that are, in essence, more and more creating real-life safety issues in some cases, the companies say, well, we're not liable. And once again, this is due to our rules, our regulations not catching up to today's digitally mediated realities.
And what are our vulnerabilities globally, particularly with regard to players like Russia, China, and North Korea? How vulnerable are we to hacks, to ransomware? And do you think that the 16-point agreement that Biden and Putin came to a month ago satisfies some of our security requirements, or do you think it was just a kabuki theater?
I would say most of this is kabuki theater. There is, in essence, an attention to the need to ameliorate concern over the increasing threats that we face, but not meaningful action to rein this in. Like, let me give you an example. If you wanted to stop most hacks, and again, this is not a silver bullet that magically eliminates all of them, but if you wanted to stop most hacks, you would compartmentalize your data, you would have access controls that are much more severe, and you simply wouldn't collect certain data to begin with. And one way that you could incent that would be to create a liability for companies that are storing our personal data. Where you say, for example, hey, the FTC will fine you, company X, $1,000 per record that gets hacked and put out on the web. Well, as soon as you add that liability or that potential liability to being hacked, these companies will architect their systems radically different. And the scale of the hacks, instead of being measured in millions, tens of millions, or hundreds of millions of records, will be far smaller. And the end result will be we, the people, will be far safer. But the fact that we don't do that means that, in essence, there's all the incentive to collect as much information as possible. There's all the incentive to cut corners on your operational security, because that costs money. And there's no real meaningful accountability if you, say, lose 100 million people's records, which happens with shocking regularity.
Right.
And so there is a mechanism where, the government doesn't need to overprescribe the mechanism that a company uses to secure our information. It simply needs to introduce a liability for the failure to protect us, the consumer using this product, from what is very clearly, almost always, severe lapses in operational security amongst these data brokerages and data collecting companies. And that is not rocket science. It's not even difficult to do. But what it requires is a political will that thus far has been solely lacking in Washington, D.C.
Sascha, we have, I believe, a very responsive representative in Congress, Jared Huffman. And connectivity and broadband are key issues in his district, because his district, California 1, stretches, it's a narrow band all the way from Marin County all the way up to the Oregon border. And we're very rural, we're very coastal, it's redwood country, et cetera. So connectivity and broadband are huge, huge issues. We're going to make sure that a copy of this program gets into his hands. And again, he's just very responsive. If you were to be advising him as to what legislation should be introduced, make some concrete recommendations to Congressman Huffman.
Sure. So, and I have advised a number of offices and worked on a variety of bills over the years. So, this is both hypothetical, but also I think can be fairly well concretized. We had proposed originally that we build our national superhighway infrastructure to include conduit that would provide connectivity to anyone that wanted to light that up. That is a very concrete proposal called Building the 21st Century Broadband Superhighway. We've also been involved in laying out a lot of the investment strategies in terms of building out infrastructure and ensuring that there is sort of backhaul connectivity within, say, 50 miles of anyone who wants it. And you can see this in sort of the Clyburn bill. Klobuchar has put out a couple of things. Some of this is pending right now as we speak in terms of the infrastructure bill. But it would be a mistake to think that we can sort of drop the mission accomplished banner once that passes. The reality is we really do need a visionary leader, a Congress member, to say, hey, we need to mandate universal access. And this is not a radical idea. We had already done this decades ago with telephones. There was a universal service fund and a universal service mandate that came very close to getting universal service across the country. And that was done by fiat, by, in essence, requiring that telephone service be universally available. We need to do that for the internet as well. And until that happens, very specific constituencies, the poor, the minority, and the rural, they will be at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to broadband connectivity. Their speeds will be slower, their costs will be higher if connectivity exists at all. And that really is a change in, once again, this social contract that we make between us, the residents, and the taxpayers of the United States and the federal government. And that hasn't been updated for the digital era.
Very good. Why don't we close the show with telling our listeners how they can find out more about your work and how they might join a local digital community. Again, I just digital freedom is all about being free. Northern California is nothing if not that. We have we're highly localized, we're highly tribal even. And tell our listeners more about how they can find out about your work and just joining local digital communities or forming one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the great news is that there's a lot of interest. And as soon as you plant a flag and say, hey, I'm interested in these notions of digital equity, I'm interested in these notions of local community broadband, et cetera, you will find that many of your friends and neighbors are likewise quite interested in the same. And there's a lot of national organizations with chapters all over the country. I work a lot with something called the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. And there's a lot of efforts to document, in essence, the realities that we all live, which is to say there's work like Measurement Lab, which is looking at broadband speeds across the United States. There's a new effort that will be launching in 2 weeks to collect broadband pricing data that folks should keep an eye out for. I also have a globally unique name. So anyone Googling for Sascha Meinrath will pull me up, and I'm often very easy to contact and try to respond when folks reach out to me and provide them direct access to resources in their own backyards. But the long story short is a quick look at, in essence, your neighbors, your friends, your community organizations will often uncover that there is a critical mass of individuals right next to you who are very interested in these issues. And there are a lot of national organizations that are more than willing to help and assist folks get off the ground, interconnect with other resources, and in essence become our own best advocates for universal, affordable broadband connectivity.
Dr. Meinrath, we thank you so much for this informative program, and we would like to have you back as things develop and perhaps look at contact tracing with COVID, some of the other issues risen out of the COVID pandemic. And we didn't get to touch upon the military and cyberspace. So I think we have still a lot to cover. I wanted to thank you again for being our guest. And Dr. Meinrath is the Palmer Chair in Telecommunications at Penn State University. He's also with the Institute for Cyber Science, Penn State University. The spelling of his name is Sascha, Sascha Meinrath, Meinrath. If you would like to Google him and learn more about him and go to his program. Thank you again for being our guest.
My pleasure. Really, really great to be here.
Thank you, Sascha.
Well, we'd like to close the program wishing everyone a happy 4th of July, and hopefully it'll be safe. And also to do what, John? To
pitch for the pledge. I had just mentioned that we are a tribal people here in Northern California in the Emerald Triangle. And we talked about creating digital communities. Well, we can create our radio community as well by supporting KMUD and by becoming a member. I mentioned this before. I've been broadcasting in a number of stations, some of them quite prestigious and a lot bigger than KMUD, but I have found a home here at this station. KMUD is true community radio. It's not the big corporate model. It's not the big NPR model. It is true community radio. We are a community of kind, loving, informed, progressive people. Please join us supporting the station. Please join our community. Please come home by becoming a member. KMUD, please become a member. Thank you for listening.
And this is a program note. We will be on the last Thursday of July and the first Thursday in August. So if you are a fan of our show, and we hope you are, please tune in at that time. Thanks again for listening.